Well, I mean, I've told you before many times, like when we've been in an argument, like the experience that I'm having is like, if only this woman wasn't in my life, then I'd be peaceful. But then I think about my life before you came in my life, and I was like, no.
It was perfect.
Yeah, no. Instead of like getting angry at you or being in an argument with you, I'd be, pacing around my apartment by myself, angry at myself.
And now you're angry
And now
at
I
me.
just get to take it out on you. It's much better.
Welcome to the Weekly Transit, a podcast exploring the intersection of Western astrology and Jungian psychology. Astrology is a language that communicates how the planets and stars influence life on Earth, while psychology helps us navigate both conscious and unconscious experiences. Together, these tools offer the potential for self-understanding, growth, and transformation. Join astrologer Scott Tajarian and me, psychotherapist Gabriella Durso, as we dive into the cosmic forecast each week.
Welcome to the Weekly Transit. This is the week of May 27th to June 2nd. We're going to begin this episode, Gabriella, in a place where you have a deep passion. History.
Not a favorite subject of mine.
No? History is not a favorite subject of yours?
No.
You don't like to live in the past? You like to live in the present? Is that, or the future? Or the unconscious is where you like to live?
I guess it depends on the day.
On the day?
Generally speaking, I don't care for history that much.
Yes.
It's just one of those subjects I have a hard time retaining, which to me is sort of an indication that it's not that interesting to me, I guess.
Okay, yeah.
I tend to remember things that I'm interested in. So for some reason, history just isn't one of those things. Sorry to any of our listeners who might feel differently, but...
Yes, well, I enjoy history. I find it fascinating, especially in the astrological context and thinking about where certain alignments are now and when these alignments were happening in the past, what was going on in the past. Maybe that gives us some insight, some reflection, some connection, correlation to what's happening presently. And so like a few weeks ago, I think we were talking about Venus transiting into Taurus. So Venus is already well into Gemini now, but when it moved into Taurus, I mentioned some dates around the last time Venus in Taurus aligned in a square with Pluto in Aquarius. And then the last time that happened where they were both at the same degree. And I got some really interesting feedback from one of our listeners whose question we answered maybe a week or two ago, Sarcastic Sea Goat. Do you remember Sarcastic Sea Goat?
I do. It's a hard name to forget.
Yes. So Sarcastic Sea Goat, who has a wonderful Instagram channel, and Sarcastic Sea Goat reached out gave like a lot of really interesting information. So the last time that Venus in Taurus was squaring Pluto in Aquarius was 1796, though it was at a completely different degree than it was most recently, a month ago or so, because it was at the end of Pluto's transit through Aquarius. So rather than being at like the second degree where it was a couple weeks ago, it was like at the 28th, 29th degree. But so Sarcastic Sea Goat wrote and said that 1796 was the year that Edward Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine and Alessandro Volta invented the first true battery. Alexander Volta, that's interesting, like volt, battery, volt. So this was interesting, especially when you think about Aquarius is innovation. Pluto, the planet of transformation, transiting through the sign of innovation. A lot of interesting innovations occurring during this transit. She also mentioned that a few years before that, in 1793, Eli Whitney created the cotton gin. This ultimately resulted in more slavery in the U.S., people in positions of power using inventions in not great ways, causing unintended consequences, is a Pluto and Aquarius theme. So I thought that was interesting too, because you're like, oh great, the cotton gin. But it created this boom for cotton that boomed slavery. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to look and think about how innovations that are occurring now and how some of their maybe positive outlook or hopefulness of these inventions have consequences that don't feel so hopeful.
Well, I wonder how much of that is just kind of the nature of the human experience. I don't know. Can we attribute that to Pluto and Aquarius, or is that just something we kind of have to accept about human life? We invent something that's intended to solve one problem, and then it
creates more problems.
Creates other problems, and then we then have to invent other things to then solve those problems. I think some of that is just there's a cycle that we're creating of problem solving for us to understand.
Exactly. You solve one problem, you create more problems. Right.
You take a medication to solve one problem and you end up with side effects, and then you take more to, there's like I think we see that in multiple areas of life.
Yes. Sarcastic Seagoat also says something else that really sticks out to me is about this time is when Napoleon staged a coup. The monarchy had been overthrown, only for Napoleon to try to reinstate it. Before that, a two-party system was adopted after the king was guillotined. The two-party system inevitably made its way to America. So what she says is, which in connecting that to today, a lot of people right now from both parties are coming together to protest and speak out about corruption. So they'll be curious to see if this will ultimately lead to the dismantling of the two-party system in the U.S. It's like at one period, the last time Pluto was in Aquarius, it created this two-party system. And now that Pluto's in Aquarius again, maybe the two-party system ends. It's like the cycle.
Interesting.
Now, 1533 was another time when this alignment was occurring between Pluto in Aquarius and Venus in Taurus. And that's when Copernicus's theory that the sun was the center of the solar system was told to Pope Clement VII, and he loved it. That inevitably led to more accurate natal charts in astrology studies. So that's kind of interesting too, because what do we see a lot of now? There's so much talk about flat Earth. So it's like 2 cycles ago when Pluto was in Aquarius, people were like, oh, the world is round. The sun's the center of the solar system and not the Earth. But now people are starting to say, maybe it's fringe or whatever, but it's like growing up, I didn't hear a lot about flat Earth, but now there's a lot of theories about the Earth being flat and the sun is orbiting around this flat Earth as opposed to the Earth orbiting around the sun. So,
well, this reminds me too of what you were saying a couple episodes ago about this is just more evidence that we're living in the Piscean age, because you're getting people arguing both sides.
Yes.
And probably more than two sides, who knows, of that issue.
Totally. There's a lot of confusion about our origins. Who are we? Where are we? What happened in the past? Is there clarity from the past?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's often a dominant view, like we have mainstream opinions about all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then there comes up this sort of like nagging voice from somewhere else, like, well, I don't know.
Yeah. Is that real?
Is that,
Mm-hmm.
So that's also in some way like a two-party system
Yep.
in and of itself.
Yes. Well, then also during this period, a few years later in 1538, there was the first banned book list. So government-sanctioned censorship has been consistent in pretty much every Pluto and Aquarius transit since then. A lot of government censorship happening in this period, but also back then in the 1530s.
Well, that reminds me too of the censorship that we talked about around cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
How now people are doing that to each other.
Yep, exactly. Sarcastic Sea Goat says that in April 1287, which I mentioned was the last time that Venus in Taurus squared Pluto in Aquarius at 2 degrees, 1287 to 1288 was when guns became prevalent in China. So that's when the hand cannon specifically came into warfare. So that changed warfare. And
how do you see that as related to Venus and Taurus? Because that sounds very opposite how I would imagine Venus and Taurus.
Yeah, but Venus is the planetary ruler of the senses. Taurus is the planet. Taurus is the sign that rules the senses. So it's bringing in innovation into that sensory reality. And it's a square, right?
Right.
Pluto, the god of death, squaring off with Venus, the goddess of love. Death to love through the hand cannon. I mean, that's one way to look at it.
Okay. That makes sense.
April 1287 also falls within the 24-year period that Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road to China, and paper also started to be used and improved in Europe around this period. So that's when record keeping became more regular in the West. From the look on your face, my love, I can see what your history teachers must have thought of you when you were in class and they were trying to teach you about history.
I'm sorry, I cannot retain this.
You could not look more uninterested than you do right now. As soon as I start talking dates and...
Maybe it's the dates where I get lost.
Yeah.
It's like my mind just... la la la, like it just goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
I will say this is the most interesting that I think history can be, to think of it in astrological terms. So thank you, Sarcastic Sea Goat. No offense. No offense.
No sarcasm in your thanks there for the...
No, we really appreciate the information.
I certainly do. I certainly do. I love it.
I think that's the only time I really find history useful, is when it can inform the present or inform the future. I have a tendency to get lost, I think, when I don't understand how I'm meant to apply that information.
History is something that's applied to all of us because we're here. Where do you come from? There's really not a lot of clarity for as much research and much has been written about history. It's not as clear as you would hope for it to be. Because who wrote it? What was their intention? There's a lot that goes into it.
Well, I think when we're learning history in school, at least my experience when I was taught history was that I didn't understand why... I didn't understand the concept that history repeats itself, that we end up in these, with these same similar situations with an opportunity to make a different choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it's framed that way, it's incredibly valuable. But I remember learning history and having no idea why that was important. And of course, when you're talking about therapy, personal history is incredibly important because you're talking about it as it relates to this is why I am the way I am is sort of the first step. And then you get to decide what you want to do with that information. Not that it has to keep you where you are indefinitely, but that's the first step in recognizing that you want to change, is understanding why you are the way that you are based on the past experiences that you've had. And once you've arrived at that, then you can decide how to move forward.
I think it's important to take that sort of broader concept into world history. Yeah, I think when you're learning history in school, it can feel very dehumanized because you're talking about dates and places on a map and not really about people. You know, like when I had my awakening to become an astrologer, and I spent a year researching this historical book. And it was because the book focused mostly on the fights of these boxers. There were some anecdotal stories which humanized them to some degree, but that's why I started looking at where the planets were when they were born, so I could put it into that more conceptual reality of their personalities. Like if you think of a historical figure in terms of their personality, what was this man or woman like as a living, breathing person, like any other person that you come into contact with? When you can see it from that perspective, that they had wants, hopes, dreams, fears, then it becomes relatable. Then you can see it as like, oh, this is like me in some way. And I think that's maybe some of the trouble with history and the way that it's taught in schools, is it's too focused on the raw data instead of the story.
Like memorizing the facts.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like this war happened from this date to that date. This many people died. This country invaded that country. Okay, like but who was there? Who was affected? What were their stories? It's when you can tell the story of an individual, that's when it becomes powerful. That's when it becomes memorable.
I think what's more powerful for me is trying to understand the lesson from events. Like what were we invited into learning in those experiences? And then if we didn't learn it, we're likely to have to repeat those situations because there's another invitation to learn whatever that lesson is. So for me, I think it's actually less about the people. But I understand why it is for you, because you love autobiographies.
Yes.
In general, I think I'm more interested in the meaning or the lesson or the karma or the part that's not about people as individuals.
What does that mean?
Well, it's like what I was just saying around what do particular events say about our level of consciousness on the planet? And as we move forward, does our consciousness continue to expand or does it contract? And to me, that's I guess that's where the interest lies for me. We have experiences because we're meant to be learning from them.
Right.
And if we continue to have the same experience over and over again, to me that indicates that we're not learning. And so why would that be? Is there a reason, maybe astrologically, that we need to be living in the same cycles for periods of time so that we can truly learn on a deeper level and then we can move forward? Or is it our own, I think of it sometimes as we can learn what we're invited to learn when our level of consciousness aligns with these planetary connections. And if those can both happen at the same time, then we're like co-creating a lesson or finding meaning in a particular event, finding meaning in the events that typically, historical events always seem to create suffering. Like whenever we're talking about them, it's always around like issues of life and death, it seems, and war.
Yes.
So
that's a lesson that people don't learn, right? From generation to generation.
right.
It's like one generation of young men goes to war. Many die, some come home. And then a generation or two later, it's as if it's been forgotten, the pain and suffering that occurred through that experience, and more young men go to war. Many die, some come home. And it just, again and again, talk about not learning from history. It's because they forget, I'm assuming, what happened, that they go into battle again. But then it's also what leads to that point of battle to begin with. Like when you think of the last time Pluto was in Aquarius was the American and French revolutions, and this feels somewhat like a revolutionary time once again. But it's been 250 years. So what was the lesson that was learned 240 years ago that was forgotten and needs to be relearned today?
What do you think that is?
Well, when you think of Aquarius, it's about individuality. And so when people lose their sense of individuality, they forget themselves. And they get pushed into a pen like an animal. And after a while, their true nature has to come alive. And so they revolt from their masters of the pen in order to reclaim their individuality. But it's like between then and now, more and more of the individuality was lost. More individuality has been lost over time to the point where there's none left. You have to choose this or that. It's a very binary choice. I don't fit in this or that. I'm something that's different.
So are you saying that individuals, that the lesson is around following what you want to do instead of like going to war for someone else or for a cause that's not maybe not relevant for you personally? Is that what you mean?
Maybe. Could be. I'm not sure. But it's about independence. Is the choice that you're making independent to you, but also with respect to those around you? It's like, why did the American and French revolutions happen to begin with? Because the average person didn't feel like they were being represented by the person that was charged over them. And so they fought for their independence so that they would not be subjugated by this higher authority figure, the king. The king does not represent me and my needs. So I must rebel in order to claim my independence, because I'd be better off taking care of myself than being taken care of by them. And so then people were independent, but then they fell back into that subjugation. And now people are in that frame again where they're like, are these the leaders that these choices that I'm being given a choice? Is this the choice that I want? So it's like a little more evolved than it was then, because then you weren't given a choice. You were born, and wherever you were born is where you were born under this monarch's rule. Here in this country, you're not born under the rule of a monarch. The leader changes every 8 years or so, but people are exhausted with the choices that they're being given because they don't feel like the choices are helping them in any way.
I think there's also an overarching lesson around like the relationship between war and peace. And we have a tendency to believe that war is going to bring peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that that's possible.
Right.
That's quite a paradox.
It is.
I'm fighting for peace.
Yeah.
I think most people can agree that they would like a peaceful life, but they're seeing somehow that it's not available to them in that moment, and that violence is required in order to find peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important question to explore collectively, but beginning it on an individual level. I'm sure we can all identify areas in our life where we don't feel as peaceful as we would like to. All the way up to, on a collective level, the wars that we're experiencing right now. It's like we're being invited to work on cultivating our own inner peace. Like this concept that the inner is actually what reflects the outer.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to really believe that it's actually the outer that reflects the inner. Like if I can just change this thing in my environment, then I will have it internally.
But it's the other way around.
But it's actually the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that all the time with consumerism, right? If I can have this car, this house, this amount in my bank account, then I will have inner abundance.
Mm-hmm.
If I can have external peace, then I will have internal peace.
Yep.
But we've got it backwards. I think
Totally.
that's I think that is like what we haven't fully been able to integrate.
Yes.
But you see it all the time in therapy where, your inner dynamic, often whatever the relationship you have with yourself is also the dynamic and the relationship that you have with other people as well. So it's just it is the mirror.
Exactly.
And again, we do that all the time in therapy too, and not everybody is orienting this way, but oftentimes, people come into therapy wanting to figure out how to change the other people in their life.
It's so funny.
Like, I have a difficult parent. I have a difficult sibling. Like, help me. How do I change this relationship? And all we can do is our part. But we know that when we do our part, because there's an alchemical relationship between in every relationship, that when we change ourselves, when we have an inner transformation, we do change the relationship.
Totally. Well, I mean, I've told you before many times, like when we've been in an argument, like the experience that I'm having is like, if only this woman wasn't in my life, then I'd be peaceful. But then I think about my life before you came in my life, and I was like, no.
It was perfect.
Yeah, no. Instead of like getting angry at you or being in an argument with you, I'd be, pacing around my apartment by myself, angry at myself.
And now you're angry
and now
at
I
me.
just get to take it out on you. It's much better. It's much easier that way. So I can blame you for all my problems.
Perfect.
And not myself.
Yep.
So that's the beauty of a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, if you think about it, it's mirroring really our relationship between the unconscious and the conscious, right?
Yeah.
Because we think that our consciousness is what creates our reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that car in the driveway or that money in the bank account. That's sort of the narrative of like, oh, if the other person just changed, everything would be great.
Right.
But it's actually, from a Jungian perspective, it's our unconscious that is dictating most of our life, that we don't have a tendency to see it that way. So it's our inner life. It's the part of ourselves that we are unaware of that is running the show.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So from that perspective, war will never fix our problems.
No. Well, and even if you look at it from a historical perspective, and that's what's fun to look at history, when you think about you can trace every war that is happening on our earth right now back to the First World War. And you could probably go back before that, but there's just a very clear line of World War I begat World War II, begat the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq conflicts, all the conflicts that go on in the Middle East. All of it stems from, what's going on in Eastern Europe. It all stems from that First World War. And that was supposed to be, when that war ended, it was the war to end all wars. That's what they said at the end of World War I. Was the war to end all wars. It was the great war. It was the war that we had to have so that we could have eternal peace. And then less than 20 years later, there was an even bigger war.
Well, it's like that expression, an eye for an eye.
Yeah, everybody goes blind.
Except it's an eye for 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 an eye indefinitely.
Yeah.
Like it's never enough.
Yes, exactly.
It's never enough.
One of the themes of this week is raising the consciousness. Raising our consciousness. When you think of the different transits that are occurring right now, all of them in some way, shape, or form are helping us to raise our conscious awareness. The first transit of the week is Mercury, the messenger of the gods, guide of souls to the underworld, the planet of consciousness, communication, coordination, transiting through the fixed earth sign symbolized by the bull, Taurus, aligns in a sextile, a positive aspect, to Saturn, the planet of authority, achievement, responsibility, the god of wealth and time, which is transiting through the mutable water sign symbolized by the fish, the sign that represents the unconscious, Pisces. This transit is occurring most strongly from May 26th to the 29th. That's this past Sunday to this Wednesday, with an exact sextile occurring on May 27th, Monday. So this is the third of 4 notes that we are receiving to awaken our unconscious. So the first wake-up call began with the sun transiting through Taurus. It formed a sextile with Saturn in Pisces. That was on May 6th, followed by Venus in Taurus aligning with Saturn in Pisces. That was May 13th. Now we have Mercury in the same position. On July 5th, over a month from now, is when Mars will align in the same position with Saturn. So the first one was the sun, bringing vitality and light to the unconscious from Taurus, the sign of reality. Like when you think of Taurus, this is one of the signs that represents reality. The sun was bringing light to reality, aligning with Saturn, one of the planets that represents reality, in the sign of the unconscious. So it's bringing unconscious to reality.
It's also helping us figure out what we're learning, right? Because Saturn is the planet that indicates teaching,
Achievement, authority, because of knowing.
But learning, I think of it as learning too, right?
In a sense, you're learning through doing the work.
So what are you learning? The sun is your identity. What are you learning about yourself?
In relationship to the 5 physical senses, which is Taurus, aligning with, like, that Saturn in Pisces is about taking responsibility for becoming aware of what's going on in the dark edges of your mind.
Right. And I wonder if it's also helping you connect a parallel between Taurus are the physical senses. You could say that what is conscious, while Pisces is the unconscious. So if it's helping you perhaps kind of expand your awareness in both of those realms, the conscious and the unconscious.
Yes.
Helping to make that connection.
Exactly. And so then when Venus gets there, that's the senses. It's awakening your senses. And now Mercury is that actual conscious awareness, because we're seeing it from our mind's eye.
So what am I learning about myself, my identity? How is that showing up in my sensory awareness?
Yes, exactly.
And then how is that showing up in my mind?
Thoughts. In my thoughts. Yeah.
And then Mars, how is that informing my actions?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So those are the steps that are occurring, and that's the first transit of the week. Later in the week is when Mercury continues on through Taurus and forms a conjunction with Uranus. This is from Wednesday to Saturday, May 29th to June 1st. So the first aspect with Mercury and Saturn is last Sunday to this Wednesday. The second aspect with Mercury aligning with Uranus, the primordial sky god, the planet of revolution, rebellion, innovation, independence, and the unexpected, also transiting through Taurus. That is from Wednesday to Saturday. So that is also like a wake-up call. What is the nature of my thoughts? And what is the nature of my thoughts and how I relate to my physical reality, my values, my self-worth? And are those thoughts independent to me? Or are they something that I've picked up from someone else? Or something else?
Do they really belong to me?
Do they really belong to me? That's the wake-up call here.
That's a big question.
Yes. So we begin the week with Mercury aligning with Saturn, which is exact on Monday. This Mercury and Uranus conjunction is on Friday. So by the end of the week, we've already had some time to really sift through the unconscious a little bit and have that insight by the end of the week that, is this me? Is this thought me? We spend so much time in these alternate realities of Netflix, films, television, Instagram, all this sort of stuff. Is what's going on in my unconscious me? Or is it something that was put there? Like I think I've mentioned before, when I was much younger, I I had various periods of my life where I was like addicted to video games. You know, like there were times where I'd stay up all night long playing video games. And so sure enough, when I would go to sleep, what was I seeing? The video game.
Mm-hmm.
I was dreaming about the video game. It wasn't my unconscious. It was the unconscious that was placed there by what was on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So is it mine, or does this come from something outside of me?
You could say that that question is the entire individuation process.
Right.
Which is why Jung believed that it began in your late 30s, because that's typically the period where, and it happens sooner too, but when you can really start to parse out kind of what was passed down to me from my parents versus how do I want to really deviate from that if I do?
Yes.
And there's a process called giving back projections, which projections can be, we talked a little bit about projections, but projections belong to the individual, but we have a tendency to, when we can't sort of navigate that within ourselves, we can project certain qualities onto another person that actually belong to us, that actually live in our unconscious. And so there's a tendency, everyone projects, it's a part of human life, but hopefully the more you recognize that it's happening, the less it will happen. There can be projections from parents onto children that happen quite frequently. One common kind of path is the children end up living the unlived lives of the parents.
Well, you see that all the time in sports.
You see that all the time. And then at some point, the child realizes this isn't even my dream.
Yeah.
And they have to give the projection back to the parents.
Right. Totally. The parent wanted to be a professional football player, but
got a knee injury or something.
Or just wasn't good enough to really, but thinks, if my dad had only spent more time with me on this sport, I would have been able to go far further in the sport. So when I have a kid, I'm going to really be there for them and push them in the way that I wished I was pushed. And then the kid's like, ends up realizing that this is not my dream. This is my dad's dream. When I don't really care about being a professional football player. But that's what my dad wanted for himself, didn't get it. And so he put it on me.
And it gets so intertwined because we form our belief systems when we're so young.
We don't know any different.
And we don't know any. So it's not necessarily, I want to make sure I'm clear, there's not always malintent on the parents' side.
No.
Sometimes there is.
Sure.
Like there's coercion and,
yes,
it can get ugly. But children are forming their belief systems before they even have explicit memories. And so, of course, they're absorbing belief systems from their parents. Their parents' favorite sporting team is their favorite team.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean it's really their favorite team, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot that happens sort of intra-psychically.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting what you're saying about the unconscious. So I'm not sure that we've really talked about this yet on the podcast, but Jung believed that we have a personal unconscious, but we also have a collective unconscious.
Right.
So that there are layers to it, so that we have within our own psyche, our own unconscious, what we are unaware of within our own system. But we are also exposed to the collective unconscious, which that's where we have unconscious belief systems that are informing us on a deeper level. That's where our understanding of archetypes lives. So for example, if you said to someone, what does a queen represent, even without us having met or interacted with the queen or understanding, we know what that means.
Right.
We know what that represents.
So that's a collective unconscious belief that a queen means fill in the blank. Most people are going to say the same thing.
Well, and we also can have unconscious bias that can be passed down, that can live in the collective unconscious. That's one of sort of the common beliefs around how racism gets passed down from generations, even though it's rare that we're actually being explicitly taught to be racist, but we end up with these, why do I feel this way about a certain group? Because that lives in the collective unconscious.
That makes sense.
As well.
Yes, that makes sense. Very interesting. So our third transit of the week is Mars, the god of war, the planet of action, aggression, and conflict, which forms a conjunction with Chiron, the wound, and the ancient wisdom that is unlocked through healing that wound, together in Aries, the cardinal fire sign symbolized by the ram and ruled by Mars. This is Sunday to Saturday, with an exact conjunction occurring on May 29th, Wednesday. So this is May 26th to June 1st. So maybe this is also a part of that sort of wake-up call, awakening the collective unconscious in terms of fears, insecurities. Like, where do you get that fear from? You know, it's like when you talk about collective unconscious, and maybe this isn't that, but I feel like it's kind of like that, where it's like you see a spider and you're like, ah! A spider! Because your mom or dad freaked out when they saw a spider in the house. So now you're afraid of the spider. And there's a lot of other people that are afraid of spiders because there's this collective unconscious belief that spiders are bad. They can kill you.
Yeah, that's a great example. And think about the most common fear is the fear of the dark as a child.
So yes, fear of the dark is a collective unconscious belief. Right? So, when you think about this transit of Chiron and Aries, which has been occurring since 2019, it's bringing up collective unconscious fears. Fears that we have on an individual level, but some of those fears may be relatable to others.
They're inherited.
Yes. So, with Mars transiting through and forming that conjunction with Chiron, it is urging us to charge towards our fears. So what are you most afraid of? That's a question. What are you most afraid of? What are you most insecure about? And in what areas of your life would you like to act more courageously than you ever have before? That's an assignment for the week.
That's a lot. That's a heavy homework assignment.
We're going to be pushed there regardless. It's like, just be prepared to meet your fears this week. And you're going to have the opportunity to run towards them or run away from them. Hopefully you're running towards them.
One way for us to understand too what is in our collective unconscious is to look at maybe collective fears could help us. Because remember that if it's in your unconscious, you're unaware of it. And so it can be, you can't name something that you're unaware of, right? That's why we have dreams, so that we can get insight into our unconscious. So one way to maybe look at what lives in the collective unconscious is to look at sort of collective fears and to imagine how you might relate to those. So I think collectively we could say that one of our greatest fears is a fear of death itself. And so you might not consciously believe that you have a fear of death, but it lives in the collective unconscious. So it is influencing you.
Yes.
It's also interesting to consider, we started this episode talking about history, which I was, a little bit
afraid of.
Not afraid of, but I don't always. Yeah, I have a little resistance sometimes to looking at the collective history, but that does live in the collective unconscious as well. And so we can look specifically at our ancestors. This is why so many people are talking about ancestral healing
Yes.
and the importance of that, because those issues do still affect us today because they've been inherited.
Totally.
They just don't necessarily affect us on a conscious level.
Right.
Maybe, depending on who you are, maybe you have that understanding.
Yes. I mean, I just think about my own familial history. My grandpa is a survivor of the genocide, the Armenian genocide. And so that is something that we carry with us in our bloodline.
And I would
That
say that's
fear.
a fear of death.
Yes, fear of death, fear of hunger, fear of not having enough, fear of being thrown out of your home and marched to your death. My grandpa was, I think, 7 years old when his parents were taken from him, and he never saw them again. And he never saw his home again. So when that happens to somebody, it's like my dad, this is on the other side. My grandpa who survived the genocide is my mom's side, but my dad, also Armenian, his grandmother told him when he was a child, Sarkis, never go hungry. Never go hungry. And my dad was like, as a kid, was like, okay, what are you even talking about? Why would I go hungry? It wasn't a concept to him, hunger. Like when he's hungry, he goes and gets food. That's what you do, right? But his grandmother, who also survived the genocide, understood hunger and not having food. And so that fear of going hungry got passed down. And you have mentioned this, and just seeing like sometimes the behavior around the children in my family, that they need to eat all their food. Because
eat every bite on your plate.
Exactly. Take one more bite, finish that bite. You're not going to have any dessert unless you eat a little bit more. Well, that's the unconscious fear that stems from a lineage that has experienced hunger and not having any food.
Absolutely. That's how it perpetuates.
Yes. Yes. And so this Mars conjunct Aries transit is very powerful in awakening those fears, those insecurities, and encouraging you to face them.
Well, and oftentimes, this is kind of another rabbit hole we don't need to go down today, but one way to look at sort of your relationship with fear is to look at your relationship with food. Just as an aside.
Yeah. Yes, that makes sense. So continuing along the theme of the unconscious and the conscious, this week the moon transits from Capricorn to Aries, and when it transits through Pisces, the sign of the unconscious, the moon, the planet of the emotions, transiting through Pisces, the sign of the unconscious, aligns with the sun, the planet of conscious and awareness. It's the light, transiting through Gemini, the sign of the conscious, the mutable air sign symbolized by the twins. This squaring of the moon and sun, which you'll look up and you'll see the half moon, is Thursday, May 30th at 10:13 a.m. Pacific Daylight Savings Time. So the moon transiting through Pisces, bringing that emotional sensitivity to the unconscious, while the sun, the giver of light, life, and vitality, bringing that light, life, and vitality to the conscious. There's some sort of tension here between what we're discovering that used to be beneath the surface, that now we're becoming aware of. How do we deal with it? How do I deal with what I was previously unaware of? Now I'm aware of it, and I don't like it.
How much of my unconscious can I allow into my conscious awareness?
Yes.
That's the question that the ego asks.
Yes.
What can I let through? what do I have the capability to process?
Yes. So
It's oftentimes why we only remember part of our dreams.
Yes.
Because there's only so much at a time.
You're right.
That you can let in.
Totally. It's too much
to
have the whole thing. So I'm curious to know from any of our listeners what's coming through for you. What are you becoming more consciously aware of in yourself that you were previously unconscious of? Some of that is going to be coming out this week with Mercury aligning with Saturn in Pisces, and then Uranus in Taurus, and then Mars and Chiron in Aries, and then this squaring of the moon in Gemini. It's like a lot is the moon in Pisces and the sun in Gemini. A lot is coming up. A lot is coming up this week. And then the final transit of the week is Jupiter, the planet of luck and expansion, also transiting through Gemini. So expanding the conscious, because that's Gemini, forming a trine with Pluto, which we began the episode talking about. Pluto transiting retrograde, the god of death, the planet of transformation, lord of the underworld, in the fixed air sign symbolized by the water bear Aquarius. So this is occurring from May 25th to June 7th, with an exact trine occurring on Sunday, June 2nd. So there's some sort of transformation of the collective unconscious, or the collective consciousness here, as Jupiter is expanding the conscious, forming the trine with Pluto, the planet of transformation, in the sign that represents the collective.
Another way to indicate what we're meant to be more conscious of besides dreams is to start to notice and integrate synchronicities.
What does that mean?
A synchronicity comes from the word synchronous or simultaneous, which means happening at the same time. So essentially a synchronicity is a coincidence. It's something that you don't understand how these two things happened, sometimes more than two things at the same time, but you notice that pattern showing up in your life. Like for me, this happens sometimes in my work with clients, where I'll have 3 clients in the same day say something that's very similar to me. And so what that indicates, there's some sort of a message there. There's something coming through in the unconscious for me to pay attention to.
Right.
And that could be whatever that thing is. It usually has personal significance to me, but it also has significance to each of those clients. So a synchronicity is something to pay attention to. Jung didn't believe that there were coincidences, and I actually don't really believe that there are either. I think they're messages that are coming through that are important. It helps us know that something important is happening with that information.
And this feels like a synchronicity to you, this Jupiter alignment with Pluto?
I'm just getting a sense from the transits, all of them that you're talking about for this week, that there's going to be an invitation to look at some synchronicities.
Yes. I think of it as, like, what you're saying is similar to something that I say quite often, that like there's signs, there's always signs. The only question is, do you see them, and are you paying attention to them? And so I feel like this week there's going to be some signs that come to the surface, let's say, of our conscious awareness that will be hard to ignore.
Okay.
And so, most importantly, for all the history buffs out there, I went back and looked at every time that Jupiter in Gemini aligned with Pluto in Aquarius. I'm not going to give you all 25 dates because I know that would bore Gabriella to
I'll go
tears.
Take a nap until
exactly,
you're done.
Exactly. So the last time Pluto in Aquarius formed a trine with Jupiter in Gemini was July 15th, 1787. The last time that Jupiter in Gemini formed a trine with Pluto in Aquarius while Pluto was retrograde at 1 degree, which is the same degree that they're meeting at this time, was August 3rd, 1404 BC.
Cool.
That means nothing to Gabriella.
Well, does that mean anything?
That's thousands of years ago.
Does that mean anything
34
to you?
Well, I don't even know what was happening in the world at 1404 BC, because 1404 BC is 1404 years before the birth of Christ. So we're talking about 3,500 years ago, basically. So I challenge any historians to come up with what was going on August 3rd, 1404 BC. There was 25 instances between now and then where Pluto in Aquarius aligned with Jupiter in Gemini. Now, it's going to happen again for us. April 15th, 2037 is when Jupiter in Gemini will align with Pluto, while Pluto is direct in Aquarius at 22 degrees. So that's in 14 years from now. No, 13 years. 13 years from now. So what does that mean to you? I'm curious to know. We'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
See you then.
Thank you for listening to the Weekly Transit. If you're curious to learn how these transits or any others may be affecting you, or if you are interested in learning more about your astrological code, contact me for a reading at theweeklytransit.com. If you're interested in delving into the world of psychotherapy with Gabriella, you can connect with her at innervisionpsychotherapy.com. This episode was produced by me, Scott Tajarian. Music written by Ben Leinbach from Listen Deep by Amber Herzog Lyman. Wishing you all the best as you ride the planetary waves.